Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Julie. Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm Greg Davis. Those who are regular attenders on the webinars will know I'm current chair of the London branch of IIRSM, but you've got me presenting as well today. So I'm here to talk about, as you'll see the title, Legionella, a lesson in risk management. To give you some background, I'm a microbiologist by qualification, worked for what was the Public Health Laboratory Service for a number of years, doing everything from water and food microbiology to patient isolates. I then spent a year in a big white suit making vaccines, and thereafter joined Assurity Consulting, where I've been for the last 30 years. One of the things I did get involved with, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, is I was a retained expert at the Barrow Furnace outbreak of Legionella disease in 2002 for the second trial, and really want to use that as my basis for looking at why Legionella is without doubt a clear lesson in risk management. So if we will click over, we will. So just by way of background, so everybody's on the same page. Some of the things that haven't changed. Legionella is a bacteria. It is ubiquitous. It is found in all open water systems. It's found in rivers, lakes, streams. Can also be found in wet soil. Currently, I think approximately 63 species. I think a new one was identified this year, which is Legionella antarctica. Not all of which are infectious in humans. It is an opportunistic pathogen. We have created the situation around which Legionella causes us issues. Being an environmental bacteria, it has a relatively broad range of temperature within which it will grow, and that's anywhere between 20 and 45 degrees C. So that has significance then when we start to look at our building systems and services, because those that will operate within that range will also tend to be able to have Legionella multiply within it and colonize. As far as infections are concerned, primary transmission route is by breathing in contaminated droplets of water. So that's another consideration we need to make in building up this picture of how Legionella does what it does. There's been one described case of person-to-person contact in all the thousands, and that was one from some years ago. There have been a couple of, again, described cases of people aspirating water, so water going down the wrong way and then going on and developing Legionnaires' disease. You can't get it through washing your hands in contaminated water. That's never been identified, but by far and away, and the one we need to concern ourselves with most is these contaminated droplets of water that then somebody could breathe in and will go on and cause infection. So if we look from a risk assessment perspective, the 5 key stages are: 1, contamination, and that's the potential for the bacteria to enter a water system. I did say it was ubiquitous, and that does include mains water. It can be found in very low numbers in mains water. Obviously, it will exist there, it will survive, but once it gets into our buildings, if conditions right, that's where it can start to cause a problem through amplification. So that's the potential for it to grow. One of the other things about Legionella and why it was initially quite difficult to identify, first recorded outbreak was 1976, Bellevue Stratford Hotel. It took 6 months to identify the causal agent, and one of the reasons was it has 2 specific growth requirements. One is ferric iron, and the other is an amino acid called L-cysteine. They also, as part of this process, are therefore relevant, because if we have poorly maintained systems that do have any iron content, and that is corroding within the water, that could add further nutrient. And similarly, the amino acid L-cysteine is a byproduct of the metabolism or degradation of other organisms that might be in the water. It could be protozoa, it could be other bacteria. And so again, systems that are not very clean could select and help as part of that amplification process. Third is transmission, and that's the ability of a system to create droplets of water. Now, while most systems have that, even a water from a tap impacting on a basin can create a droplet of water. We're really looking at those that will create a wide range of droplet sizes, therefore more likely to select one that's going to penetrate deep into the lung and lead to an infection if it's contaminated. So things such as evaporative cooling towers, showers, spa baths, those kind of systems tend to produce those aerosols in great quantities, and therefore are key components there. Next element looks at exposure, and that is somebody then is there to inhale that droplet of water. And then the last one is host susceptibility, and that's potential for a susceptible individual to go on and be exposed. Not everybody who breathes in a contaminated droplet of water will go on to develop the disease. In about 60% of cases, there is an underlying susceptibility, and that can be anything from diabetes, heart condition, chronic lung conditions, smoking, excess drinking, etc., are all causal agents. As our age, if you're over 50, you're more likely to develop a legionellosis than those under 50, and men are in general 3 times more likely to get it than ladies. So they are some of the susceptibility factors we need to be aware of. In terms of really recognition in the UK, while there had been outbreaks prior to this, it was April 1985 when the Stafford District General Hospital outbreak occurred that really brought it to the public and government attention. And in looking back at that, that was prior to any formal set of regulation or guidance being in place for Legionella. But a guy called Jeff Brunbrett in '92 applied what was catastrophe theory to what went on insofar as the outbreak was caused at Stafford District General Hospital, and he identified these 5 elements. So the formation of an error chain. So there was a lack of good communication that developed through this error chain. There were gaps in responsibility of what people should be doing. There was a rigid and limited perception of what the management should look like. There was poor controls in place. There was difficulties in passing information. So that really set the scene as far as initial look into Legionella went, and from that we started to see regulations. So there were 2 reports by Sir John Badenoch into the outbreak of Stafford District General Hospital, and pretty soon after that we got our first piece of guidance, which some people may remember was a document called EH48. That came out, as you can see, in 1987. Unfortunately, outbreaks at the BBC, that was April 1988, a number in London and also in other city centres in the intervening time saw more needing to be done as far as the control of Legionella. And we saw in 1991 our first approved code of practice came in, which, as you can see, there's prevention or control of Legionellosis, including Legionnaire's disease, and that had some technical guidance associated with it in HSG 70. In 1992, further regulation came in. This was notification of cooling towers and evaporative condensers. At the time, these were a major focus, particularly in outbreaks. Not the only cause of outbreaks, but certainly a major focus. And one of the things we didn't have was a reliable list of where these devices were should an outbreak occur. So this regulation looked to satisfy that demand by requiring anybody who had a device, we'll look at this in a little while anyway, to notify that through to the local authority so that immediately they had a point of reference should they need for the future. In 1994, the approved code of practice was again revised along with the HSG 70 guidance. I think they split, they went from 1 document to 2 documents. And then in 2000, the new approved code of practice, Legionnaire's disease, control of Legionella bacteria in water systems. And again, the technical guidance was updated once more. And they are the key elements as far as looking at the Barrow outbreak, because all these were relevant to a greater or lesser extent over the time for which the cooling tower operated. So if we look at Barrow, we look at how the approved code of practice was enabled. There was a series of, we have the Health and Safety at Work Act with sections 2, 3, 4 and 6 would be relevant. So people with a health and safety background will be aware of those. So section 2, the employer has responsibility for his employees. People not in their employer, section 3. Section 4 relates to premises, so responsibility for premises where they are not, so where there's a shared responsibility there, and section 6 is manufacturers of goods or articles. They were the main provisions there and still remain so. As far as the management of health safety at work regulations, at the time it was Regulation 3 and Regulation 5, so that's risk assessment and health and safety arrangements. Cost was Regulations 6, 7, 8, 9 and 12, so again, suitable and sufficient risk assessment, Regulation 6. This notion of prevention or control, always look to prevent before you look to control, as we will have seen, was reflected in the approved code of practice, is Section 7. Then the remainder we have then use of control measures, making sure that those control measures are effective, the maintenance, and then information, instruction, training and supervision. We also had, as I mentioned, the notification of cooling towers and evaporative condensers. That was in play, and then also the various approved codes of practice, in which at the time of the outbreak, which was in July, August 2002, it was the 2000, so edition 3. Going back to that, I mentioned 2002. It's 20 years ago, and just by way of taking us back to that time, it was a time when the euro became the official currency of 12 of the founding 12 of the EU member states. Strangely, we're seeing talk about NATO now in great detail. That NATO had expanded at the time in 2002 to include a number of the Baltic states and other former Soviet Union members who were accepted. Queen Mum sadly died. A Beautiful Mind won the Best Picture Oscar. Lance Armstrong won the Tour de France, but then didn't. Again, for all reasons we know happened in the interim. France won the Six Nations, and again have done so again this year. Arsenal won the Premier League. That's not going to happen this year. And the backdrop to the year, as far as music goes, for those that remember, it may have included some of these. As you look through that list, these were apparently the top 5 selling singles for 2002. Some very new and some slightly older artists featured there. It was also, unfortunately, as I said, the period over July and August 2002 when over the weekend, so the 29th of July, over that immediate weekend prior to that, there was a number of people admitted who looked like they had some form of pneumonia. And microbiologists picked this up, and on that day, the first case as to one of these came back as identifying it as Legionnaire's disease. The following day, the second case was identified. Now, both these people had links in the recent past with the centre of Barrow, and as a result of that, both have been identified with what looked like the same illness over the same period of time, with both of them having been in the same location. An outbreak control team was formed, and that started the process into the investigation that led them to the Baltimore cooling towers at 4 and 28 in Barrow as being the source of this outbreak. Outcome of the epidemiological investigation saw sadly 7 people die as a result of the outbreak. A further 180 being infected, although some people say it was a lot more than that. They were identified as being affected, of which 134 of them were hospitalised as a result of their infection. Subsequent investigation into what had happened involved the Crown Prosecution Service, the Health and Safety Executive and Cumbrian Police, as would be expected. Their investigation led to the Barrow Borough Council and their design services manager, a lady by the name of Gillian Beckenham, being jointly charged with 7 counts of manslaughter. Council were also charged under Section 3 of the Health and Safety at Work Act. Gillian Beckenham was also charged under Section 7, which is one you may notice was not in the original, not in the requirements. It's not one of the regulations or the acts, one of the sections that enables the approved code of practice, but it is, again, for those who know the health and safety will know it's failure through your act or omission is what she was charged with. Timeline as a result of this saw a trial in March, April 2005, which, as it transpired, turned out to be the first trial into the event. Council pleaded guilty to the Section 3. they were found that the case was against them for the 7 counts of manslaughter was actually the judge at the time was Mr. Justice David Poole, and was no case to answer, because at the time for gross negligence manslaughter, or manslaughter in this instance, it was identification doctrine that exists, and because the co-accused was a 3rd-tier manager, that didn't fit that criteria. So I know some people report they were found not guilty. They weren't found not guilty. There was no case to answer that. As far as Gillian Beckenham was concerned, she was found guilty of Section 7, but there was a hung jury on the 7 counts of manslaughter, which resulted in the second trial between June and August 2006. And also following that, there was a public meeting in December 2006, and a report into that public meeting, which again we'll dip into in looking through this. She at the second trial was found unanimously not guilty of the gross negligence manslaughter charges, but again the previous charge under Section 7 resulted. We will have a look at what resulted from that a little bit later. But in terms of actually what happened and trying to get a picture of overall how did this occur, it is still today the worst outbreak of Legionella disease in the UK in terms of numbers. Thought we'd break it down and start looking at the main elements. So the first one was policy, and really health and safety policy and anything associated there is your statement of intent, and should be looked at in meeting these elements. So what your statement of intent as far as what you're looking to comply with, what objectives have you have within that. So it's got authorization and endorsed from your senior management and be regularly reviewed and regularly implemented. The Borough Council did have a health and safety policy and did have a series of arrangements that identified roles and responsibility and various activities. Unfortunately, in terms of it providing them any effective defence in the case, it was not the case. I'm just going to read here. This is the sentencing remarks from Mr. Justice Brunton, who looked at who presided over the second case, and that's Mr. Burton. And that is, health and safety, as we have heard, was not an agenda item for senior management. The result of that was that health and safety was not, and the necessary precautions were not monitored by senior officers. There was a written policy on health and safety, which as a matter of drafting was a thing of, as I've said, some beauty. If it had existed beyond its existence on paper, it would have very substantially mitigated the blameworthiness of those representing the borough, so far as this outbreak is concerned. But there was no evidence that this policy existed other than simply on paper. And obviously that's one element to start off with that may start to paint a picture of actually what went on. Second aspect to consider is the notification of cooling towers. As I said, this regulation came in 1992. Barrow or Forum 28 had 2 VXR cooling towers that were in. They were on the edge of the car park. Now, from what I've heard in talking to others, I obviously wasn't there at the time it was built, or indeed involved at the time of the outbreak. I did not get involved until 2006. The towers originally exhausted to atmosphere, but a further 2 layers of car park were built over them, and as a result, we will see in the later diagram, there was a series of ducts that were put over the top of them, and they then extracted into this alleyway to the side of the car park. But as far as notifying them to do, they were notified to the local authority. That was in December 1992, so relatively promptly after the introduction of the regulations, and that was through the technical services manager, Kevin Morthwick, who signed those off. So let's have a look at the approved code of practice that was in place and the main elements for that. Most people who are dealing with Legionella on a regular basis will recognise these 5 elements as the main part of the approved code of practice. They've not changed. We're now on our 4th edition, which came out in 2013. The headlines, these elements have not substantially changed over that time. And I just want to look at each of these in a little bit more detail in terms of what the requirement was at the time and what was actually found. So if we look at risk assessment, it is our foundation document. What it needs to do in the eyes of the approved code of practice is cover all water systems present. then it should allow the duty holder to make a decision on where exposure can be prevented or it needs to be managed, and therefore controls can go in place. It is a reference document. It is something that's there to be used. It's not a document, and I think Jeff talked about this in our one before last webinar. It's not a document to sit on the shelf. It's there, you know, the best risk assessment, the ones that have got coffee stains on, or somebody's written a rude comment against something that's been said. But it starts to identify what those elements are within the system, and it's being used to help proactively manage it. And it also needs to be reviewed on a regular basis. At the time, there was 5 key elements that should trigger a review. So any changes to the system, changes to the use of the building, should any new information come to light, if you no longer believe your control measures were effective, or if a case of Legionella disease was associated, then they should all trigger a point in terms of risk assessment review. There was also the technical guidance, this idea of 2 years. If you haven't reviewed it within the 2-year period, then perhaps you should look at it. But they were the ones that were in place at the time. Unfortunately, the cooling tower, which went in just prior to the introduction of the first approved code of practice in 1991-92. So it was in before that, and it had a meeting from the health and safety executive, had gone in to look at it, provided controls for it, which were being used, but there was never a risk assessment to the day it was turned off in August 2002. It ran without a risk assessment over that period of time. There were numbers of people involved in that, both from a contract perspective and a management perspective within the council, but there was never a risk assessment performed on the system at Forum 28. So if we look at management responsibilities, and again, these were quite well documented within the health and safety policy and arrangements. Requirements, I'll just let you read that and take a quick swig of water, that come out of L8 are relatively straightforward. That should appoint a person or persons to take managerial responsibility and supervision of the implementation of the precautions. If we look at what the management responsibilities were, this is, as far as we could ascertain in looking at those, an organogram of the hierarchy within the council below the elected members. And if you look specifically at Forum 28, this would be the cascade. So Tom Campbell, the chief executive, was the man there at the top of the shop. That came down to a lady called Sue Jenkins, who was cultural services manager. She was effectively acting as a property manager with a number of buildings under her control. Under her was the venue manager, who was initially a gentleman called Neil Ward. Now, he was quite important, as I'll come back and talk about, but was not there at the time of the outbreak. He left prior to that. And then under him was the technical services manager, the gentleman I'd already mentioned, Kevin Borthwick, who was responsible, as you can see, for the technical services throughout the site. Other person involved, and now we can see in the middle, is the health and safety officer. That was a gentleman by the name of Andy Beck. He was also one of the environmental health officers for the council, and effectively it was through them, if you look at most of the communication, and 1 or 2 other people who actually came and went in the intervening time, that the Forum 28 was managed. As far as Gillian Beckenham concerned, she's sat there, and as you can see, she's third-tier manager. She had no day-to-day responsibility for the Arts and Leisure Centre, Forum 28 itself, but did get involved when a contract was looking to be renegotiated. She was in, I think, had been involved in negotiations for other parts of council property. LA changed in 2000, came into force on the 8th of January 2001. Streamline and George S. Hall, who were previously providing the maintenance and water treatment, they'd identified to the council that LA was changing, and whereas they were previously doing monthly dip slides and various tests on the system, that needed now to be total viable count, so it's a more accurate measurements on what was happening within the system. That negotiation led to Interturf being asked to come in and also quote for the work. What actually went on is a little bit of a moot point. Certainly from the documentation I've seen, there was a series of specifications produced. One of the ones the council had a whole list of tests and checks to be undertaken by the third-party service provider, Interserve, who were going to have to, they were, I think, looking at a water treatment company to come in and support them with it, with the exception of the monthly tests, which the council were looking at doing themselves. And I think they'd gone through Andy back and asked if they could provide them. They said no, so they were looking for an alternative. What happens then, nobody really knows, because as far as the contract, when it was then delivered, it wasn't just the sampling that was taken out. All water treatment seems to be taken out of the contract. It was Neil Ward, not Gillian Beckenham, by his own admission in court, who cancelled the George S. Hall Streamline contract, which was the previous one. But he then left. He had resigned from working for the council anyway, and I think that was around April 2001 time. Thereafter, the Interserve contract came into being without any form of water treatment at all for the cooling tower system. That system then operated through to when it was turned off in 2002. There is some disagreement over how long the treatment chemicals would have lasted in the system. Some people think it would have been the end of 2001. Some people think it may have gone into a couple of months before they're actually turned off, so maybe as long as May 2002. But whatever, they had run out at the time they were turned off, and we will see a little bit later what the towers themselves were like. So next element in our hierarchy is looking at our written scheme of management. The requirements for our written scheme of management, again, looking at what LH says, is we need an up-to-date plan of all systems, description of how they're operated safely, what precautions need to be taken, the checks that need to be carried out, and remedial actions if the scheme is shown not to be effective. Well, with the exception of the checks to be carried out, where from the work that had been done historically on water quality, there was evidence. We will see that shortly. There was nothing else in place that even kindly you could call a written scheme. At best, it was a very poor one. At worst, it was non-existent. So there's no written scheme there. Similarly, with regards to training, if we look at the requirements at the time that were set on duty holders and those responsible to manage, it's all people involved in the management should be trained in the general requirements. The responsible person, that person who oversees what goes on a day-to-day basis, should have additional training to fully understand their roles. And those who are undertaking all the checks, the tests, the inspections and the monitoring, again, training in these areas for what they need to do and should know how they operate for those systems. Once more, as far as the council and its employees are concerned, there was no evidence that anybody had any formal Legionella training. There was some health and safety training for individuals, but no formal training as far as the management of the Legionella goes. And bearing in mind, we are looking at evaporative cooling systems at Forum 28. One of the other things we also need to do is for third parties is actually assess them as far as their requirements, either under UCAS, Legionella Control Association, or what other experience we had. Some of those who I've mentioned previously did have that, others did not, were not registered as far as the LCA goes. So the next element to consider is record keeping. Some of you may have noticed that at the bottom of some of my slides, I put some quotes that hopefully tie in. We have two here, one from Lord Chesterfield and one from Norman Cousins. I will draw your attention to these as record keeping can very much be either or. It was one of those areas where over a long period of time there was information as far as the performance of the evaporative cooling systems at Forum 28. I don't think it was ever looked at. One of the problems certainly as far as the overall contract as to why did nobody identify that there was no visits taking place or there was no chemicals being ordered or no chemicals being used, is the whole process had become largely invisible. Often the water treatment visits were occurring early in the morning before other people had got in, so they didn't know they were there. Logbooks were being filled in and left, and I think they were just getting filed. So there was information there initially. What it included needed to be looked at. So as far as your record keeping goes, some of the information you need is person overall responsible for risk assessment, as well as those managing and implementing the written scheme. Now, obviously, they didn't have that because they had neither. Significant findings of the risk assessment, they didn't have that. The written scheme itself, again, we know they didn't have that. Results of all works undertaken on the systems. Now that they did have some. So if we look at this, this is a representation. I can't provide you with the actual figures, but this is a representation of how it looked. And initially, I think we have to go with Lord Chesterfield. It was just on a piece of paper. It was a huge heap of confused facts. What we did in compiling this together, because nobody else had done this previously, and interestingly, one of the things the prosecution had said was that the historic performance of the system was satisfactory. Well, let's test that. These areas in green are where, according to the microbiological results you would get, or the tables within L8, the system needed to be checked. So counts of 10 to the 4 or above, where the system needed to be checked. This is going above what would be considered under control. So you would need to possibly resample, recheck what was happening with your dosing, have an overall look at the condition. Is there any reason why this is happening, and particularly where it's happening over consecutive periods? Let's take this one stage further. These are now counts of 10 to the 5 or above. So this is 100,000 colony-forming units of bacteria per milliliter of water, so approximately a fifth teaspoon. This is effectively identifying the system. Certainly, when you get into 10 to 6, is out of control. This is not under control microbiologically. The system, and this is starting to paint a pattern, is it not, where we can see that over the winter months and over the summer months, this system was struggling, and it was actually struggling for a number of years. Bearing in mind, if we look at when the outbreak occurred, it was 2002, and it was that June, July, August period. There was talk, never confirmed, that there may have been a smaller outbreak slightly earlier that year, around the January, February time. And again, that would tend to fit in with what we were seeing. So when the system was under stress, either in deep winter, when it was being used a lot over Christmas time, or in the summer when the weather was naturally warmer, this system struggled. Problem with it was nobody bothered to go back and look and see what this was telling them. Final requirement under the approved code of practice is responsibility of others. So as well as manufacturers, importers, suppliers and installers, it actually extends to other suppliers such as maintenance, such as water treatment, such as people like myself who will be consultants, or our organisation who will be consultants involved in providing information into the process. This element covers areas such as competence, as we'll see, limitations on service, what you can and cannot do. So if you were a maintenance company that didn't have a formal water treatment arm, for example, Georgia Solid, Streamline were effectively part of a bigger organisation, so they work quite closely together. Interserve didn't have that luxury, although I believe they were working with one or two separate organisations. But then the expertise and provision of information, as well as, and I quote, to ensure that any deficiencies or limitations identified in the system or written scheme are made known to the statutory duty holder or responsible person. And that is a direct quote out of L8. So let's put the fact there was no risk assessment to the side. Let's put the fact there was no written scheme to the side. Let's put to the side the fact that there was no formal training, and it wasn't just those organisations named. There was about 9 or 10 different organisations over the period of the time who, in some way, shape, or form, interacted with that system and should have gone back and said, actually, this is not just a little bit deficient. This is your management is very deficient. Let's have a look at what the towers actually looked like, and this is a diagram taken out of the report. Which was produced in December following the trial verdict and was published in the April the following year. And what they found at the time was chemical dosing, as we've discussed, the bicidal dosing was empty and had run out sometime previously, was not working effectively. As far as the 2 cooling towers went, cooling tower number 2, the fan damper on top of one of the fans within the tower had become so badly corroded that it was almost closed and therefore not working effectively. And in the other tower, the fan impeller blades, so these are the blades that drive air through the cooling tower with water falling in the opposite direction, which acts to cool it through the latent heat of evaporation. The impeller blades, again, have become so badly corroded that they've fallen out of the fan and were in the bottom of the pond of the cooling tower. As a result of particularly those two things, one of the chillers with the demands placed upon it had fallen over, and they were running off one chiller. This was causing, you will see if you look at just over the top of the two cooling tower pictures there, you can see where this ductwork had been manufactured to then take the extract air out, which effectively came out the side of the building and into this alleyway. Number of engineers, one of them who gave evidence was a guy by the name of Andy McDonald, who said that he went on a couple of occasions and actually raised concerns that the system wasn't working very well. One of them being that there was a lot of clouds of steam, as he put it, coming out the side of the cooling towers. He said he wrote on one occasion, emailed on another occasion. That could never be proved. Forensic examination and a look at letters coming out and going into both organisations, that could never be proved. He also said he had a meeting with Gillian Beckingham and a gentleman by the name of Peter O'Connell, unfortunately died unrelated in between the outbreak and the trial. And Kevin Borthwick, I think, was involved in that as well, to tell them that he was concerned about this. None of them said that meeting occurred. Again, it's one of those areas we will never know. But as far as this entrained water vapor coming out of the towers, the side of the Forum 28 into this alleyway, it was so extreme on occasions that there was a Wilkinson's, I was informed, on the other side of this alleyway, and they had to turn their Wilkinson sign, you know, the orange and red yellow sign that Wilkinsons typically have outside their stores. I'm sure most people recognise it. They had to turn it off because it was arcing. There was that much water vapour there. So regardless of, from a management perspective, this system was in poor condition. Why was it never flagged? In over the last 30 years, I've had 4 occasions where, having looked at an installation, I've turned it off because there were serious concerns over it, and a 2 of those at least related to actually no form of chemical treatment at all going into the system. I must admit, if this had been one that I'd looked at in this condition, it probably would have been my 5th. So what was the outcome? The outcome into the report identified 5 major failings, and this again came from Mr. Justice Stanley Burnton. He identified unclear lines of responsibility and poor lines of communication, failure to act on the advice and concerns raised, inadequate training and resources, failure to carry out risk assessment, and poor contractor management. Are we already starting to see some similarities between what was happening here and actually what had happened in 1985 as far as Stafford District General Hospital goes? It starts to paint a picture. As far as the outcome went, the Borough Council were fined £215,000. That was a £125,000 fine and £90,000 costs for their failures under Section 3. Gillian Beckingham was fined £15,000 for her failings under Section 7. That was half her salary, and again the judge did, in his weighing up, say if they've been a commercial organisation with millions of pounds worth of turnover, the fine would have been of the same ilk, but recognising that he was penalising the people of the town that the council had infected. Since that time, there have been a number of other outbreaks, unfortunately, and they still continue. But up to 2015, here's a range of some of them, and it just starts to give an impression of what the level of fines were for failure. Some of these resulted in fatalities, others did not. But that was the scope of fine for failings through Legionella. That has changed. So if you look at what's changed as far as regulatory background go, well, we've had another revision of the approved code of practice. HSG 17 no longer exists. We've got the fourth version of the ACOP, as I said, L8, and now we have 3 separate documents directly: HSG 274's Part 1 for cooling towers, 2 for hot and cold water systems, and 3 for other systems. Some total of over 250 pages now of approved code of practice and technical guidance, and they have been in place since November 2013. And one of the other changes in 2015 was the Health and Safety Offences, Corporate Manslaughter, Food Safety and Hygiene Offences Definitive Guidelines. Sorry, should have also mentioned with the revised approved code of practice, we also started to see some changes. So the management regs that were historically Regulation 3, Risk Assessment, Regulation 5 arrangements, actually also increased to include Regulation 7, which looked at health and safety assistance, so competent support, Regulation 10, which is information to employees, and then Regulation 13, which looked at capabilities and training. And also into that, those 5 criteria for when you should review your risk assessment, there was another one added, which was changes to key personnel. And I think that started to reflect more a look at management, particularly with those additional clauses. Sentencing guidelines were introduced to provide greater consistency. Not going to go into the process in too much detail now. If you would like something more on these, please let me know. But just to give you an overall feel for them, they're now based on culpability and harm. So the initial 2 tests are: 1, how culpable is the organisation, and that runs from very high, so deliberate breach or flagrant disregard, through to low, whereas in actual fact what you had in place was very, very good. It's just in this one instance something obviously went wrong, which is why it ends up in court, with high and medium between them. Against that culpability, we now have a seriousness of harm risked, and that, as you will see, looks at a high, medium and low down the left, and then the level of the harm, which is A, B or C, where level A is death or lifelong impairment or dependency. Level B is physical or mental impairment not amounting to level A, but still has a substantial long-term effect, and then level C, which is all others. And within that, we get a harm category range. So we've got a culpability and seriousness of harm risked with very high, medium, low, and then a harm category, against which is based on turnover. And there are currently 4 categories of turnover, depending on organisational size, which you can see here. So a very small organisation, a micro-organisation, is not more than 2 million. That then rises through small and medium to large organisations with turnovers of 50 million or over. These are then collided into a single table. So you will see, just pick large here, that would have been the category Borough Council was in if these had existed at the time. But then you get very high culpability harm category 1, for example, and you can see 2 columns there. The first one is a starting point. The initial fine, if you're a very high culpability harm category 1, is £4 million. That's the initial fine that the judge will be looking at. There is a broader process. There are 9 elements to it, but I'm only talking about the initial ones, just to give you an idea of where this and what change this has had on Legionella cases since. Conversely, if you were low culpability, so looking down the left to harm category 4, that starting point fine would be £10,000. So that's the first figure, or the initial figure the judge has in their mind, or magistrate. They will then look at, are there other either aggravating or mitigating factors they should take into account? So was there cost cutting at the expense of health and safety? Interser, for example, at Borough were the most expensive. So that certainly couldn't be levelled at them as far as the services they thought they were procuring. But breach of court order, poor health and safety record, falsification of documentation, you see there's a list there, that will push the fine up. On the other hand, mitigation will see that fine potentially come down in the eyes of the judge, and that's where we end up with this category range. So depending on which way it goes, your very high culpability harm category 1, then the actual fine would be in the range potentially of 2.6 to £10 million, again depending on whether it was mitigation or aggravation. And similarly with our low culpability harm category 4, that could be as little as £3,000 or as much as £60,000 as a result. So they came in on the 1st of February 2015. There were the fines we looked at previously. Sorry, I'm just checking time. These are some of the ones since. So you see, they have had a profound effect. All these were cases where Legionella was involved. Some involved fatalities. others didn't. The bottom one here sticks out. That was very recent, just before the pandemic. That was November, December 2019. And the reason the fine's so low is that both the people there are currently serving suspended jail sentences. So that again has changed, certainly changed the playing field with regards to looking at what the liabilities are now, and that was failure to risk assess and also failure to act on concerns raised by others. So what's also changed with regards to risk? If we wind forward from 2002 to 2012, this was some work done by the Health and Safety Lab on the request of the Health and Safety Executive. It did follow, it was the Olympic year, but it did follow Wales's worst ever outbreak, which occurred in 2010, and then the outbreak in Edinburgh, which people may remember, in 2012, and started to break down what were the causes. And two of the graphs I've just highlighted here. So this is looking at outbreaks, so cause of outbreak by failing. And we can see here that scheme of control and risk assessment account for the vast majority, nearly 90% of all outbreaks usually are stemmed in one or other of those areas. Training and competency follows on from that, and actually cleaning, a lot of the functional levels were slightly lower down for that. This is very much a tactical management issue. And if not to confirm that, if we look at prosecutions, and this is from the same HEX report, 93% would involve scheme of control and risk assessment, and then the other one is actually scheme of control and training. So very clearly here, if we're looking at risk and we're looking at what's gone wrong in the past, get your scheme of control, get your risk assessment, get your training wrong, and you could be on the wrong side of what the requirements are. That was 2012. Let's wind forward to 2000. Part of this was through in 2017, which is an HSE intervention program. They went out to a number of sites, thousands of sites, and looked at these. Again, were targeted evaporative cooling system locations. I can't remember what the total figure was off the top of my head, but of these, they found a percentage where issues were wrong. So I think a third, around about 600 sites, I think maybe in the region of 2,000 sites, I want to say off the top of my head. If anybody needs the detail, I can provide that. But around about 600 improvement notices or prohibition notices was served. But this starts to confirm what we've already seen. So 2012 was the previous. This is 2017. Risk assessment absent, or 14%, or 54% not up to date, in need of review, or insufficient. And that's for risk assessments for sites with cooling towers. This is 2017, this is not that long ago. Main failings leading to improvement notices under written scheme, nearly 30% absent, and a further 17% not up to date or not sufficient. And then finally, main failings leading to improvement notices served under the implementation of written control scheme, 27% lack of training. And we're starting to see a very clear pattern developing here as to where things can go wrong, and would either put you on the wrong side of an outbreak, certainly put you on the wrong side of any enforcement should it come in. One of the other things that has changed is we're starting to see an increase in the number of reported cases. This is some work we've put together based on Public Health England stats. They used to do this on a regular basis. That they stopped some years ago. So we tried as best we could to look at that. Again, Royal Society Public Health webinar I was on earlier today has identified there is an increasing trend across Europe and not just in the UK. But if we go back to round about the time, you will see 2002 in Barrow, a lot of those cases, that increase there was a result of that. We were round about the 200 mark, and that tended to be where it was through the 90s and very early 2000s. By the time we get to the mid 2000s, we're looking at somewhere over an average of 300 cases that are reported a year. And if you start to look at more recently, we don't know what's happened with regards to the figures of the pandemic, but certainly it was increasing, and we were somewhere over 400. So we're seeing certainly over that period of time, there's been a doubling in the number of reported cases. So just to finish up and allowing some time for questions if there are any, I'm going to go back to the House of Commons Employment Committee, and this was one of those as a result of that Stafford District General Hospital outbreak in April '85. And they've said, while the bacteria which causes Legionella disease probably cannot be totally eradicated from water systems, it can't. The circumstances which encourages growth are known and it can be controlled. And that is true, but that is true providing you put effective measures in place. And what we can still see, so again, this is freely available information off the HSE website if you want to look at the prosecutions and notices website, a similar pattern, failed to implement adequate controls, reasonably practical control measures not implemented, necessary levels of information, the bottom line, instruction and training to carry out these tasks completely not demonstrated. So in conclusion, I've left just some questions for you. So how is your current water stroke Legionella hygiene management structured? Is it effective based against what you've heard or some of what can go wrong today? When was the last time you reviewed your risk assessment? Are you collecting data or generating knowledge? Where are you on that process? Is the focus we need to do this test, or is the focus what was the outcome of that test? Does it demonstrate control, or if not, what we're doing about it? What competencies do you have in place for your staff and third parties? Have you checked whether they can provide you with the level of service you want to? Linking this back into the top one, how has COVID affected your water system management? Do you need to do anything there? Mr. D off the end of mine, apologies. When was the last time you had an out of spec result? Do you know? Do you go back? Do you log that in any way? And what's done? Is there anything in place to close that loop? That's good management. Nothing ever works 100% of the time. Things do go out of kilter. But if you can actively demonstrate you're identifying those and you're putting them right, that's a sign of effective management. When was the last time you formally reviewed your Legionella management process? That again, particularly as we're seeing increasing amounts of people going back into buildings, might be an opportune time to look at it. Another good time is because of the time of year it is. In the UK, we see approximately 60% more reported infections occur over the summer months. So that July, August, September time tends to be the peak. So now may be a good time to offset that. And finally, when was the last time your senior management discussed health and safety as a specific point in the meeting? Because Barrow Council believe they were doing quite a good job. The judging is summing up, I think, as we will know, thought less so. But on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much. I hope there was something in there for you to be able to take away. I'm more than happy now to answer any questions. I've left my details on the slide, and I'll hand back to Julie.
Thank you, Greg. That was a really interesting presentation. Quite an alarming increase in cases there, and it makes you wonder whether that trend will continue through the pandemic.
Well, it's an interesting one, because if you look at certainly some of the epidemiological information we've had over a number of years, there's round about 200,000 cases of all types of pneumonia, of which they estimate between 2 and 3% are community-acquired legionellosis, so legionellosis infections, possibly Legionnaire's disease. And if that figure's in viewers per year, we shouldn't be seeing 400 cases. We should be seeing between 4,000 and 6,000 cases a year is the actual number. It's a lot of them don't get identified. But what we are seeing, particularly with greater awareness, but also the ability to test. So it's a urinary antigen test. So it's a wee on the stick test now that for certainly Legionnaire's disease or Legionella pneumophilus serogroup 1 Legionnaire's disease will be picked up quite quickly.
Thank you for that. We don't have any questions at the moment. Normally, if we say we haven't got any questions, someone will ask a question. So I think there's one just come in. Let me just check. Here we go. In terms of low risk premises, mains feed, hang on, I can't read all this. In terms of low risk premises, mains feed combi boiler, would there be a need for lab test?
You need to have a risk assessment. Again, it's really that should drive it. And again, as far as low risk, it would be potentially low hazard with just mentioned. It's only low risk if you create it. So obviously, if the boiler is operating and you're serving water at 45 degrees C, or you have a it's been plumbed, you've got a large dead leg in it that's holding and retaining water and flushing back into the system, that could potentially pose a risk. So it would be, again, bearing in mind the requirements don't need domestic property, it's workplaces or where you have work equipment that you would need to risk assess. But I would say, yes, look at your control measures based on your risk assessment.
Great, thank you. I didn't know whether you just wanted to mention, but whilst we wait and see if there's any more questions coming, and whether you wanted to mention the face-to-face meet that we're organising. I know we haven't finalised all the details yet, but
yeah, one of the things, and again, we'd love your feedback on this. What we're proposing to do for June, we haven't been able to confirm a date yet. We're looking at doing that as soon as we practically can. But it's, instead of having a webinar, is holding the London branch committee meeting and effectively just a face-to-face networking event at a hostelry in the centre of London. Just saying, come and join us, have a chat, share your ideas with us, share your opinions on anything else we should be doing, and just join us in a meet the committee in a social environment. We can have a beer or two and put the world together in a face-to-face meeting. Whether people would like that, it's certainly something we're trying to get the venue for now. But yeah, if people will be happy to come and join us, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, hopefully be on the 15th of June. Fingers crossed if we can get everything organised, but we will send out a mailer on that. Okay, that just leaves me to thank you, Greg, as always, for a fascinating presentation. There aren't any more questions, but your presentation was
quite lucky there.
yeah, it was really comprehensive. So thank you. And thank you everyone for attending. The presentation will be uploaded onto the IIRSM YouTube channel, hopefully by tomorrow. So please feel free to share it with any contacts and colleagues. And I'd like to thank everybody for attending and wish you a good evening.
Indeed. Thank you all. Thanks very much indeed. Have good evenings.